Hey everyone, happy holidays and happy new year. As some of you may know, one of my New Year's resolutions for 2021 was to start listening to a lot more music. I get recommended so many different albums on a regular basis between my friends and subscribers to the channel, and I also have a lot of different albums that have been on my radar for a long time that I've been meaning to listen to but just haven't gotten around to it. So I started doing a monthly series called What I've Been Listening To, where each month I would make a list of like 20 to 25 different albums that I hadn't heard before, and I would listen to them, talk a bit about each album, let you know my thoughts, and I would score each of them on a scale of 1 to 10. And now with 2021 wrapping up, I thought it would be cool to go back and revisit all of these different albums that I checked out and narrow it down to my top 10 favorite discoveries of the year. And for some of you, a couple of these albums might be a little surprising to you. You might be shocked to find out that I'm only discovering some of these albums this year, but hopefully there will be a couple of albums on this list that you haven't heard before, and it'll give you a few new things that you can check out. All right, time to jump into it. So of the 302 different albums that I listened to this year, here were my top 10 favorites. Okay, starting us out at number 10, we have the debut studio album by Jason Falkner from 1996 titled Presents Author Unknown. Jason Falkner is a songwriter, a multi-instrumentalist, a session musician, and a producer who I hadn't heard of prior to this year, but I had found out about him through exploring the works of John Bryan, and I had stumbled upon this band called The Greys, which was sort of like a power pop supergroup consisting of John Bryan, Jason Falkner, Dan McCarroll, and Buddy Judge. And this group only released one album in 1994 titled Rochambeau, and that was an amazing album. Really enjoyed it. And the songs on that one were written in a collective manner where each member of the group would contribute a couple of their own originals. And I found Jason Falkner's originals to be really intriguing, and his writing style really caught my ear and made me want to explore more of his stuff, which led me to this album. So the first thing that stood out to me when I put on this album was the consistency from track to track. There are 12 songs on here, and I really enjoyed every single one of them. I thought the album had a great momentum all the way throughout, and every track felt like it served a purpose and nothing seemed out of place. There were no skip over moments for me. Stylistically, it is blanketed in sort of a power pop framework, but there is so much great variety throughout, weaving together a beautiful fusion of power pop, indie, glam rock, and even some experimental stuff, which really kept the album very engaging throughout. I really love his sense of melody. There are so many catchy and beautiful vocal parts all throughout this album, and he also has a very tasteful and adventurous sense of harmony as well. So many of the chord progressions would take these little turns into territories that I wasn't expecting to hear, which I always love, especially in pop music. I also really love the couple of acoustic-centered tracks that he scatters throughout the album. I thought that presented a really nice contrast to the more high-energy electric songs, and I thought the production was top-notch as well. And Jason Falkner produced this himself, and he played almost every instrument on this album as well. So incredibly self-sufficient and impressive, and just a very good album that continues to get better and better the more I listen to it. So for anybody that is a fan of the power pop genre, if you haven't heard this album before, I can't think of a better one to recommend to you. So that is it for my number 10. Now let's move on to number 9. Okay, coming in at number 9, I picked the fourth studio album by Faith No More from 1992 titled Angel Dust. For anyone who isn't aware, Faith No More is a group that is fronted by singer and composer Mike Patton, and this is one of those albums where some people might be surprised that I'm just discovering it now, and believe it or not, I've been a big fan of Mr. Bungle for years now, but I just never got around to checking out Faith No More. So this is an example of one of those groups that have been on my radar for a long time, and it was about time that I got around to listening to them. And once again, I enjoyed every single song on this album. It was incredibly consistent. Stylistically, this one is definitely centered more in the metal realm, but it still veers in and out of a couple of different feels. We have the 80s and 90s metal elements to it. There's some grunge aspects. There's a little bit of funk metal, and there's also the elements of that experimental sort of cinematic type of sound, which to me sounds like a precursor to what we will eventually hear from Mr. Bungle, so that was nice to hear as well. I also really loved Mike Patton's vocal melodies throughout this album. There were so many interesting twists and turns where he would be singing a melody, and then it would just land on this really unexpected note that just completely came out of left field and threw you off guard, and I love stuff like that. It created such a dark and eerie effect that I thought was so fitting for this music. And this album really showcases Mike Patton's versatility as a vocalist as well, being able to go from the really melodic singing into the metal growling just so effortlessly. So I'm sure a lot of you are already aware of this album, but if you haven't checked it out, I would highly recommend it. I certainly wish that I had discovered it sooner, but better late than never. So that's it for my number 9. Now let's move on to number 8. Okay, coming in at number 8, we have the 9th studio album by English rock band XTC from 1986 titled SKYLARKING. This is another band that I am ashamed to say I hadn't heard of prior to this year, but last year I went through a pretty serious Todd Rundgren phase and listened to all of his studio albums, and when I got through all of that, I had started exploring some of the albums that he had produced, so eventually I stumbled on this one, and this album completely blew my mind. I had no idea what to expect going into it, and this far exceeded my expectations. The two songwriters on this album are XTC members Andy Partridge and Colin Moulding, and I absolutely love their compositional style. They're definitely different, but I think they balance each other out really nicely. And I thought Todd Rundgren's idea to mix and match these songs to produce a loose sort of concept album was a very smart decision, because these songs just flow into one another effortlessly and create this really great blend of pop, art rock, psychedelic, and new wave. From a production standpoint, I don't think Todd Rundgren could have done a better job on this album. The production is absolutely mind-blowing, and every song in this album is just filled with interesting layers and little subtleties that just really bring these songs even more to life. And I know there was a lot of tension and butting heads in the studio between Todd Rundgren and Andy Partridge, but I'm really glad that they were able to put their differences aside enough to the point where they were able to complete this album, because this is just a masterpiece of an album filled with so much beauty and so much depth, and from beginning to end, it is just an incredible adventure that it takes you through. So check this album out if you haven't heard of it, and if you haven't heard XTC, I would highly recommend checking them out, because once I stumbled upon them and realized the genius of Andy Partridge and Colin Moulding, a whole new world of music opened up for me. So that is it for my number 8. Now, time for number 7. Okay, my number 7 is the one album on this list that I am willing to bet most people haven't heard of before, and it is the 3rd studio album by Adam Franklin and Bolts of Melody from 2010, titled I Could Sleep for 1,000 Years. Adam Franklin is the guitarist and vocalist from the amazing English shoegaze band Swervedriver, and after exploring all of their albums this past year, I wanted to dive into some of Adam Franklin's solo stuff and see how it would compare. And once again, this was one of those albums from beginning to end. It was absolutely amazing. I loved every single track, and I didn't think it had a dull moment. And it featured all of the elements that I love about Swervedriver's writing, with the amazing guitar parts, the really colorful chord voicings, sometimes in alternate tunings with these really interesting harmonic movements, as well as Adam's amazing vocal work and beautiful sense of melody. I thought the mood of this album achieved this really great combination, floating between moments of high energy, peacefulness, chill, upbeat, and melancholy all in one. So amazing album that does not have a dull moment, in my opinion. So check out this album and see if it resonates with you the way it did with me. So that is it for my number 7. Time for number 6. Okay, for my number 6, I picked the 6th studio album by Scottish dream rock group Cocteau Twins from 1990, titled Heaven or Las Vegas. And for anybody who has been following my monthly album reviews, this is the only album on this list that I initially didn't give a 10. I gave it a 9.5 because it did have one track towards the end of the album that I wasn't crazy about, and I thought it took a little bit away from the album, but over time and after listening to this more and more, it did grow on me more, and the remainder of the album is just so strong and so consistent that it just didn't feel right not giving this album a 10. And for me, this album is such a vibe. Every time I put it on, it puts me in such a dreamy and euphoric state. The The combination of the very washy production style with the really driving bass grooves and the reverb-laden guitar against the amazing vocal work of Elizabeth Fraser creates this really amazing synthesis of sounds to achieve the perfect dream pop environment. Another thing that really blew me away about this album, and something that I actually find hard to believe, is the fact that there weren't any synthesizers used throughout this. At least that's what it says online when I looked up some more info on this. And that really shocked me because it sounds like there are so many layers happening throughout this album, and to be able to achieve that with just bass and guitar is really impressive. So if you haven't heard this album and you are a big fan of really euphoric, dreamy music that really puts you into a vibe, I can't think of a better album to recommend. And I really look forward to exploring more of this band's discography. So that's my number 6. Now on to number 5. Okay, my number 5 is probably the album that I am most embarrassed to say that I hadn't heard until this year, but it is the 5th studio album by British songwriter and musician Kate Bush from 1985 titled Hounds of Love. Prior to this year, I had actually never checked out anything by Kate Bush, but she was an artist that I had heard about my entire life, and I figured it was time to start exploring some of her work. So I started out with her first album, and I liked it a lot. I thought it was very interesting and unorthodox songwriting, and I was definitely intrigued enough to want to check out more of her stuff. And then I stumbled upon this album, and this one just completely blew me away. The album is split up into 2 sides. Side 1 is titled Hounds of Love, and side 2 is called The Ninth Wave, which is a conceptual suite about a woman drifting out into the sea at night by herself. Stylistically, this album takes on a lot of different elements ranging from art rock to art pop to progressive rock, and all different combinations of those 3 styles. There's a heavy use of electronics and synthesizers throughout the album, and they do a very good job of combining them in a very tasteful manner with Kate Bush's beautiful piano playing, as well as some beautiful string arrangements and a wide variety of very exotic instruments that aren't typically used in styles like this. Side 1 is more high energy, and it features all of the hit songs that came from this album, and I really love the contrast that it creates when side 2 comes in. We have this amazing set of 7 tracks that connect together beautifully and take us through this very dreamy story of a woman drifting out into sea. And it all culminates into the final track titled The Morning Fog, which is such a strong closing song and puts such a nice conclusion to the conceptual suite of side 2, and wraps up an incredibly ambitious, tasteful, and consistent album from Kate Bush. So most of you have probably already heard this album, but if you haven't, I would highly recommend it. So that is my number 5. Now on to number 4. Okay, for number 4, we have the debut studio album by English shoegaze band Swervedriver from 1991 titled Raise. We had touched on this band earlier with my number 7 ranking with the Adam Franklin album. He is the guitarist and vocalist of this group as well. And Swervedriver has easily been one of my favorite bands that I discovered this past year. I think they are criminally underrated. And after going through their whole discography this past year, my 2 favorite albums of theirs are the first 2 releases, this album and their second release, Mescal Head. And for me, both of these albums are really interchangeable depending on what mood I'm in, so it was really hard to pick one of them as a favorite. But I would say that in terms of individual tracks that really stand out to me, I think there are a couple of more of those on Mescal Head, but in terms of just an overall very good and very consistent album, I typically go with Raise for that one. So, I kind of wanted to pick both of their albums as my number 4, but that would be cheating. So if I had to pick one, I would go with Raise. And this album is incredible. I don't think they could have made a better first release. We have 9 songs, and the album just hits us with so many hard-hitting, amazing tracks with these rich layers and textures between the 2 guitars, incredible vocal work from Adam, really full and powerful bass grooves, and amazing drums. I particularly love the way that the drums are recorded on this album, especially the snare. It's just got such a great pop to it. Production-wise, this one is much more in the shoegaze sort of realm compared to their second release. This one is more washy with more reverb, and some of the vocals being sort of obscured under the music, which is one of the things that I really enjoy about both of the albums. They have a really nice contrast from one another, and like I said, it kind of depends on what mood I'm in. I sort of kind of veer between both of them, but that's one of the things that I love so much about them. So I'm sure a lot of you are already familiar with this album, especially if you are a big fan of shoegaze. This is regarded as a shoegaze classic, but if you haven't heard it, I would highly recommend it. And if you like this album, I would say listen to their entire discography. And if you want sort of a guide as to what you might like, I did a video ranking all of the Swerve Driver albums and talking about each of them, what I like about them. So if you are interested in that, check out the tier list link in the description of this video and you'll find it in there. So that is my number 4. Now time for number 3. All right, coming in at number 3, we have the second studio album by English composer and multi-instrumentalist Robert Wyatt from 1974, titled Rock Bottom. Not only is this an incredible album, but the story behind how this was made is absolutely fascinating. In the late 60s and early 70s, Robert Wyatt had always primarily been known as a drummer, playing in groups like Soft Machine and Matching Mole. But then one night in 1973, Robert had gone to a party and got too inebriated, and he actually fell from a third-floor window, which left him paralyzed from the waist down, and he has been in a wheelchair ever since. So after this terrible accident, Robert was in the hospital recovering, and he would go out into the piano room and he would start working out some songs that he had started writing prior to this accident. And this would eventually culminate into him writing and releasing this album. And because of the physical limitations that Robert had to now face, being paralyzed, he started focusing much more on keyboards as well as his vocals and other percussion instruments that he can use that don't require his feet. And because of this, I think that his songwriting style transformed significantly for the better. This album has a really great fusion of art rock, progressive rock, psychedelic rock, and experimental, all combined very tastefully into one. It also has some really great spacey and washy production from Nick Mason of Pink Floyd. And when I first put this on, right from the opening track, I was completely intrigued. This album reaches peak levels of intensity and darkness and has some very spacey and psychedelic elements to it as well. But there's also this element of love to it as well. And in a way, it is a very emotional commentary on his connection with his wife, Alfie. In terms of instrumentation, one of my favorite elements of this album is the use of the Riviera organ. Definitely one of the most distinct features of this album, in my opinion. And I think having Nick Mason produce an album like this with this sort of instrumentation was a very smart move, because it definitely achieves a lot of that spaciness that we hear in a lot of Pink Floyd's music, which I really love, but is also very distinct and unique to itself. The album is 6 songs long and takes us through this very intense and emotional journey, and eventually culminates into the final section of track 6, which is this really beautiful viola part played by English musician Fred Frith, and it's just such a nice and heartwarming way to conclude this very intense album. A couple of other noteworthy features on here are English guitarist Mike Oldfield, as well as Hugh Hopper on bass, who was the bass player for Soft Machine, and many, many more. So this album was easily one of my favorite discoveries of this year. There is so much depth and so many layers to it, and every time I listen to it, I pick up on something new, and I would highly recommend this album. Regardless of what kind of music you are into, I think this is a very important album, because not only is it a great piece of music, but it's a very inspirational story too, of overcoming a very terrible thing that happened to him and coming out on the other side, writing so much great music and just setting up a whole new trajectory for his career. So can't recommend this album enough. That is my number 3. Now time for number 2. Okay, coming in at number 2 is Scott Walker's third studio album from 1969, titled Scott 3. This album is the third installment of a series of 4 albums that go from Scott 1 up to Scott 4. And while I love all 4 of these albums, I've always found that 3 is really the exceptional one. On Scott 1 and 2, it consisted mostly of covers with only a couple of his own originals thrown in there. And Scott 3 was one of the first albums where it was almost all originals. We have 10 originals, and then the album concludes with 3 cover songs. And one of the things that I love so much about Scott Walker's music is the really dreamy and majestic nature of it, as well as the really beautiful and vivid imagery that his lyrics paint for the listener. And to me, this is the album that really reaches the peak levels of the dreamy imagery that I love so much about his music. The instrumentation and the arrangements from Angela Morley are superb. The choice of instruments are so nice, and I think they complement Scott's vocals and songwriting just so beautifully, particularly the way that the strings are arranged, as well as the use of the harp and the flute. And I think that this album achieves a really great balance of beauty as well as eeriness. And I think the opening track, It's Raining Today, is a perfect example of that, because we have this really mellow and pretty vocal and string part, but then underneath that we have this really haunting and really tense violin part that just keeps getting bowed all throughout the first half of the song, creating this really interesting dichotomy of beauty and eeriness. And that's one of the things that I love so much about Scott Walker as an artist and a songwriter. He's got this great ability to always push the envelope and always stay true to himself. And this is another one of those albums where the more I listened to it, the more I liked it, and I still pick up on new things every time I listen. And this is probably the album that I've listened to most this past year, I would say, just based on my Spotify Wrapped and, what tracks popped up the most. I think this is my most listened to album of 2021. Just from beginning to end, it's filled with so much depth and puts me in such a dreamlike state every time I listen to it. So absolutely incredible album. I would definitely recommend this one. It's probably not going to be for everybody. I think Scott Walker is a very acquired taste, but if you are a fan of art rock with some experimental stuff thrown in there, there's definitely a chance that you will love this album. So that is it for my number 2. Now it is time for the big reveal. Here is the number 1 album that I discovered in 2021. Okay, coming in at number 1 for my favorite album that I discovered this past year, we have the debut and unfortunately the only studio album released by John Bryan from 2001 titled Meaningless. I had always known about John Bryan through his amazing film scores, but I had never checked out any of his solo stuff and I wasn't aware of it until this past year. And I had actually stumbled upon this album through Elliott Smith. There is a concert on YouTube from the John Bryan Show way back in the day, and John Bryan and Elliott Smith are performing a bunch of Elliott Smith originals throughout the concert, and then at one point they throw in an original from John Bryan called Trouble, and that song really caught my ear and I was instantly intrigued and I had to investigate more of his stuff, and I ended up finding out that that song was from this album. So I checked it out, and it was actually kind of hard to find. This album is not on any streaming services, and there are basically 2 ways to listen to it. You can listen on YouTube, or you can order a CD on eBay, which is what I did. And this album completely blew my mind. It was some of the best power pop that I've ever heard in my life. It's got a great batch of 11 songs. 10 of them are originals, and 1 of them is a cover. And they talk about a variety of different topics ranging from love to fear of commitment to depression and anxiety. And John Bryan played all of the instruments on 10 of the 11 tracks on here. So it really showcases his talents as a multi-instrumentalist, a songwriter, and a producer as well. Every single song on here is incredible. We hear influences from all over the place, ranging from the Beatles to Elliott Smith to Radiohead, but it's still very distinct and unique to itself. John's sense of harmony and melody are second to none. There are so many beautiful and colorful chord progressions and vocal parts, and a really great mixture of guitar and piano-centered tracks. I just cannot get enough of this album. It has a couple of songs that, after I initially first listened to it, I listened to a couple of these songs over and over and over again, just obsessively, because they were so good, and I'm so grateful to have stumbled upon this masterpiece, and I really hope that John Bryan releases another solo album at some point in the coming years, because as far as I'm concerned, this is a perfect album. So that is my number 1 album of 2021. If you have not heard this one before, please do yourself the favor of checking it out and let me know what you think. I do not think you will be disappointed. Alright, so that is it. Those are my top 10 favorite albums that I discovered this past year. And I didn't really talk too much about individual tracks on the albums. Instead, I wanted to give you more of a general overview of what the albums are like stylistically. But if you are interested in checking out more from these albums, I made a playlist of a couple of my favorite tracks from each of them, and I included a link to that playlist in the description of this video. But yeah, if you listen to any of these, please let me know your thoughts. I would love to hear what you think. And if you have any recommendations based on the 10 albums from this list that you think I might like, please send them my way, and I will add them to my master list of albums to get to in the coming months. So that is it for now. Thank you so much for watching. And again, Happy New Year to everybody. I hope you have a great start to 2022. And I will talk to you guys soon. Take care.